In a galaxy where strength defines worth and weakness means death, humanity stands as the most despised species, too primitive for the advanced civilizations, too stubborn to know their place. But, sometimes, the most unlikely guardian emerges from the most unexpected corner of the universe. When Marine Sergeant Jake Morrison crashlands on the royal world of Zephyria during what was supposed to be a routine supply run, he discovers something that will shake the very foundations of galactic society: a blind alien princess, cast aside by her own people, possessing a power so immense that entire star systems would kill to control it. What happens when a battle-hardened human soldier, trained to never leave anyone behind, meets an alien noble who has never known kindness? What happens when the weakest member of the most advanced species finds protection in the arms of the primitive race everyone underestimates? Some bonds transcend species. Some smiles can rewrite destiny. And, sometimes, the greatest strength comes not from what you can see, but from what you choose to protect. This is the story of how one human's compassion ignited a revolution that would change the galaxy forever, and why aliens learned to fear the most dangerous phrase in any human language: "Nobody hurts my friends." The warning sirens in Jake Morrison's cargo shuttle screamed like banshees as he fought the controls, his knuckles white against the emergency steering system. Through the cracked viewport, the alien world of Zephyria rushed toward him in a blur of purple forests and crystalline spires. What was supposed to be a simple supply drop to the human diplomatic outpost had turned into a nightmare when Zephyrian fighter ships had appeared out of nowhere, their energy weapons tearing through his shuttle's hull like paper. "Mayday, Mayday, this is Terran Supply Vessel Charlie 79, Jake spoke into his communicator, knowing full well that his transmission range had been fried along with most of his ship's systems. "I'm going down hard on Zephyria. If anyone receives this, tell command that the Zephyrians fired first." The ground was coming up fast now. Jake could make out individual trees in the alien forest, their twisted branches reaching toward him like gnarled fingers. He pulled back on the controls with everything he had, trying to angle for the clearest patch he could see. The shuttle bucked and groaned, pieces of hull plating peeling away in the screaming wind. Impact came like a hammer blow to his entire body. Jake's harness cut deep into his chest as the shuttle plowed through tree after tree, each collision throwing him against his restraints. The sound was deafening, metal shrieking against alien wood, systems exploding in showers of sparks, and his own voice yelling curses that would have made his drill sergeant proud. When everything finally stopped moving, Jake hung upside down in his pilot's seat, blood trickling from a gash on his forehead. The shuttle had come to rest at a 45-degree angle, nose down in a crater it had carved through the forest floor. Emergency lighting cast everything in a hellish red glow, and the acrid smell of burning electronics filled his nostrils. Jake worked methodically to free himself from the harness, years of military training overriding the pain that shot through his ribs with every movement. His right shoulder felt wrong, probably dislocated, but he could still use the arm. That was something. He dropped heavily to what used to be the ceiling, landing among scattered supplies and debris. His first priority was inventory. Jake pulled his military pack from its storage compartment and began sorting through what had survived the crash. His M4 rifle was intact, along with 4 magazines of ammunition. His combat knife, water purification tablets, emergency rations, and basic medical supplies had all made it through. Most importantly, his quantum communicator was damaged but might be reparable. As Jake worked to secure his gear, he became aware of voices outside the wreckage. He froze, straining to listen. The voices were speaking in the musical, flowing language of the Zephyrians, but the tone was harsh and commanding. Through a gap in the twisted metal, he could see figures moving through the forest, tall, elegant beings with pale blue skin and elongated limbs, dressed in what looked like ceremonial armor. Jake gripped his rifle and moved carefully toward the breach in the hull. His training kicked in as he assessed the situation. 6 Zephyrians visible, probably more he couldn't see. They were searching the area systematically, but something about their body language suggested they weren't looking for survivors, they were looking for something else entirely. That's when he heard it. A soft whimpering sound, almost musical in its cadence, coming from deeper in the forest. The Zephyrians had heard it too, and they were moving toward the source with purpose that made Jake's blood run cold. He'd seen that kind of deliberate movement before, in soldiers who were hunting something helpless. Every instinct told Jake to stay hidden, to wait for the aliens to leave, and then try to reach the human outpost. But that sound of vulnerable and afraid reminded him of something his squad leader had drummed into every Marine under his command: we don't leave people behind. Ever. Jake checked his rifle one more time and slipped out of the wreckage. The forest floor was spongy beneath his boots, covered in something that looked like moss but glowed faintly with bioluminescent patterns. The alien trees towered overhead, their bark smooth and silver like mercury. Jake moved from cover to cover, using skills learned in a dozen different war zones to stay invisible to the searching Zephyrians. The whimpering grew louder as he got closer. Through a cluster of the strange trees, Jake could see a small clearing where someone sat huddled against the base of an enormous trunk. Even at a distance, he could tell it was a Zephyrian, but smaller than the others, younger, maybe. This one wore simple white robes instead of armor, and their posture spoke of complete defeat. The armed Zephyrians had found their target. As Jake watched from concealment, they formed a circle around the huddled figure, their weapons not quite pointed but ready. The largest of them, wearing more elaborate armor that marked him as a leader, stepped forward and began speaking in their flowing language. Jake couldn't understand the words, but the contempt in the tone was universal. The figure in white looked up, and Jake got his first clear view of her face. She was definitely female, with the same pale blue skin and elegant bone structure as all Zephyrians, but there was something different about her eyes. They were larger than normal, almost luminous, but they didn't focus on the speakers. She was blind. Jake's jaw tightened as he watched the scene unfold. The armored leader was clearly giving orders, gesturing away from the clearing. The girl, and she couldn't be much more than that, despite the adult proportions, shook her head desperately and said something in a pleading tone. The response was a backhanded blow that knocked her sideways. That was all Jake needed to see. He'd witnessed enough bullies in his time to recognize the signs, regardless of species. His rifle came up smoothly, and he sighted on the leader's center mass. "Hey, jackass," Jake called out in his best command voice, stepping into the clearing with his weapon trained. "How about you pick on someone who can fight back?" The effect was immediate and dramatic. All 6 Zephyrians spun toward him, their own weapons snapping up with practiced precision. For a moment, the clearing was frozen in tableau, 6 elite alien warriors facing down one battered human soldier, with a blind alien girl caught in the middle. The leader spoke first, his voice carrying the authority of someone used to being obeyed. Jake didn't understand the words, but he caught the questioning tone. "Sorry, I don't speak Space Elf," Jake replied, keeping his rifle steady. "But I think we can communicate just fine with body language. Back away from the girl. Now." The leader's expression shifted from confusion to what Jake interpreted as amusement. He spoke again, longer this time, and the other warriors relaxed slightly. Jake caught what sounded like laughter in the response. "Yeah, I get it," Jake said. "Primitive human thinks he can take on the advanced aliens. Real original." He took a step forward, his rifle never wavering. "But here's the thing about humans you might not have heard: we're really good at killing things that threaten people we care about." The blind girl had turned toward Jake's voice, her face showing an expression of complete bewilderment. She said something in her musical language, a question directed at him. Jake risked a quick glance at her. "Just stay calm," he said in the gentlest tone he could manage while still maintaining his combat stance. "I know you can't understand me, but I'm not going to let them hurt you." That seemed to break the standoff. The leader barked an order, and the other warriors began to spread out, trying to flank Jake's position. But they were moving with the fluid grace of beings who had never faced truly desperate opposition. Jake had learned to fight in places where desperation was a daily reality. His first shot took the leftmost flanker center mass, the crack of his rifle echoing through the alien forest. The warrior went down hard, his elegant armor no match for human military-grade ammunition. Jake was already moving, diving behind the massive tree trunk as return fire sizzled through the air where he'd been standing. The Zephyrian weapons fired some kind of energy beam that turned bark and wood into superheated plasma. Jake could feel the heat even through the thick alien tree. But energy weapons had limitations that kinetic weapons didn't, and Jake had been in enough firefights to know how to use that advantage. He popped up from cover and put 2 quick rounds into another warrior before dropping back down. The Zephyrians were shouting to each other now, their musical language taking on harsh, staccato rhythms that sounded like tactical communications. They were trying to coordinate, but Jake wasn't giving them time. The blind girl had curled into a ball at the base of her tree, her hands over her ears. Every shot, every energy blast, made her flinch. Jake's heart went out to her, but he couldn't break cover to provide comfort. Not yet. A warrior tried to rush his position while the others provided covering fire. Jake caught him halfway across the clearing, the alien's graceful charge ending in an ungraceful tumble. 3 down, 3 to go, but Jake's ammunition was finite and their energy weapons weren't. The leader was shouting orders, trying to reorganize his remaining forces. Jake could hear them moving through the brush, attempting to get angles on his position. Time for a change of tactics. Jake pulled a fragmentation grenade from his belt and cooked it for 2 seconds before hurling it toward the area where he'd heard the most movement. The explosion sent alien debris flying, followed by a scream that sounded remarkably human in its pain. 2 left, including the leader. Jake reloaded quickly, his hands working by muscle memory while his eyes scanned for targets. That's when he noticed that the forest had gone silent around them. No alien birds, no rustling of whatever creatures lived in these woods. Just the crackle of burning vegetation and the leader's voice, now talking in what sounded like a communicator. Calling for backup. Jake's situation had just gone from bad to worse. Change of plans, he muttered, then called out to the blind girl. Hey, princess, we need to move. Now. The girl looked up at his voice, confusion clear on her face. Jake made a quick decision and broke cover, sprinting across the clearing while laying down suppressing fire. The remaining warriors returned fire, but Jake's erratic movement made him a difficult target. He slid to a stop beside the girl, immediately putting himself between her and the enemy positions. Up close, he could see details that hadn't been visible from a distance. Her robes were made of some incredibly fine material that seemed to shimmer with its own light. Her skin had an almost translucent quality, and those oversized eyes were definitely sightless but somehow still expressive. I'm going to get you out of here, Jake said, knowing she couldn't understand but hoping his tone would convey his intentions. But I need you to trust me. The girl said something back, her voice carrying a tremor of fear but also something else, hope, maybe. Jake helped her to her feet, noting how delicate she seemed compared to the warriors he'd been fighting. She was tall by human standards but built like a dancer rather than a fighter. Energy beams scorched the air around them as Jake began moving toward deeper forest cover, keeping the girl close to his side. She stumbled occasionally on the uneven ground, but she kept up better than he'd expected. There was a natural grace to her movements that reminded him of water flowing around obstacles. Behind them, Jake could hear the distinctive whine of aircraft engines. The backup was arriving, and it sounded like more than just a few soldiers. Time to disappear. Jake led the girl deeper into the alien forest, moving as fast as her unfamiliar gait would allow. He could hear search parties spreading out behind them, their energy weapons scorching paths through the undergrowth. But Jake had advantages they didn't expect. Human endurance, for one thing, he could keep moving long after most species would collapse. And human adaptability, every environment was just another puzzle to solve. As they moved through the strange woodland, Jake began to notice something odd about his companion. Despite her blindness, she seemed to anticipate obstacles before encountering them. She would shift direction slightly to avoid low branches he hadn't seen, or step around holes in the forest floor that would have been easy to miss in the alien twilight. After an hour of steady movement, Jake called a halt in a dense grove where the trees grew so close together that aircraft couldn't maneuver effectively. The girl sank to the ground immediately, her breathing labored but controlled. Jake took up a defensive position and tried to assess their situation. They were lost in an alien forest, pursued by forces he didn't understand, with no way to contact help. The girl couldn't speak his language, and he had no idea why those warriors had been threatening her or why she'd been alone in the forest in the first place. But, as Jake looked at her, sitting quietly in the alien twilight with her hands folded in her lap, he realized something important. For the first time since he'd found her, she was smiling. It wasn't much of a smile, just a small upturn at the corners of her mouth, but it transformed her entire face. There was something about that expression that reminded Jake why he'd become a Marine in the first place. Sometimes you fought not because you understood the bigger picture, but because someone needed protection and you were the only one standing between them and harm. The sound of approaching aircraft grew louder, and Jake knew their rest was over. He helped the girl to her feet and checked his remaining ammunition. 2 magazines left, plus his sidearm and knife. Not much against what sounded like a full military response, but humans had won fights against worse odds. "Come on, Princess," he said quietly, using the nickname that had popped into his head during the firefight. "Time to show these space elves what humans do when someone threatens our friends." As they moved deeper into the alien wilderness, Jake had no way of knowing that he had just made himself the most wanted criminal in Zephyrian space, or that the blind girl beside him was the key to powers that could reshape the galaxy. All he knew was that someone had needed help, and he'd been there to provide it. Behind them, the search parties spread out like a net, their technology and numbers overwhelming. But they were hunting something they'd never encountered before, a human who had decided to take a stand. And, as any student of military history could tell them, that was a very dangerous thing to face. The alien forest had no day or night cycle that Jake could recognize. The trees themselves seemed to provide illumination, their silver bark pulsing gently with bioluminescent patterns that shifted like slow breathing. It had been several hours since their escape, and the sounds of pursuit had finally faded into the background hum of whatever creatures called this place home. Jake had found what looked like defensible ground, a small valley between 3 massive trees whose roots had grown together to form natural walls. The girl, whom he'd been thinking of as Princess, sat with her back against one of the root barriers, her head tilted as if listening to something he couldn't hear. "Water," Jake announced, returning from a brief scouting mission with his canteens full. The alien stream he'd found tasted strange, but his purification tablets had given it the all-clear. "And no sign of our friends with the fancy armor." Princess looked up at his voice, those luminous eyes tracking toward him with uncanny precision. She said something in her musical language, the tone questioning but hopeful. "I wish I knew what you were saying," Jake replied, settling down beside her with a grunt. His shoulder was definitely dislocated, and his ribs were protesting every movement, but he'd been hurt worse. "But I'm guessing you're asking if we're safe." "Answer is, probably not for long." He offered her one of the canteens. She accepted it with both hands, her fingers brushing against his for a moment. Her skin was warm and incredibly soft, but there was something else, a slight tingle, like static electricity. Princess drank carefully, as if water was precious, then handed the canteen back with what was unmistakably a grateful smile. That smile was doing things to Jake's chest that had nothing to do with his injured ribs. "So," he said, settling back against the roots and trying to ignore the way she seemed to glow faintly in the forest's ambient light. "Want to tell me why a squad of heavily armed soldiers was threatening one blind girl in the middle of nowhere?" Princess tilted her head at his tone, clearly recognizing a question even if she couldn't understand the words. She spoke slowly, gesturing with graceful movements of her hands. Her voice was musical even in apparent explanation, rising and falling in patterns that seemed almost like singing. Jake found himself watching her face as she spoke, noting the way her expression shifted with her words. There was intelligence there, and sadness, and something else that looked like determination. Whatever she was telling him, it was important to her. When she finished, Princess looked toward him expectantly. Jake spread his hands helplessly. "I got about 1 word in 50 of that, but you've got a beautiful voice." The compliment made her cheeks darken to a deeper blue, which Jake filed away as interesting. "Look, I know you can't understand me either, but maybe we can work something out. My name is Jake." He pointed to himself. "Jake." "Jake," she repeated carefully, her accent making his name sound like a musical note. Then, she pointed to herself and spoke a word that sounded like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. Jake tried to repeat it and mangled it badly. Princess laughed, and tried again, speaking more slowly. After 3 attempts, Jake managed something that made her nod approvingly. "Okay, that's going to take practice," he said. "Mind if I keep calling you Princess? You've definitely got the bearing for it." As if summoned by the word, Princess straightened slightly and touched something at her throat. Jake hadn't noticed it before, but she was wearing what looked like a pendant on a thin chain. In the forest's glow, he could see it was made of the same material as her robes, something that seemed to capture and amplify light. "Royal jewelry?" Jake asked, nodding toward the pendant. "I was joking about the princess thing, but maybe I wasn't wrong." Princess followed his gaze and her expression shifted to something complex, pride mixed with pain. She spoke a few words, touching the pendant gently, then let her hand fall to her lap. The way she said it made Jake think of something his grandmother used to tell him about family heirlooms. This wasn't just jewelry, it was a symbol of something lost. A distant sound made both of them freeze. Aircraft engines, still far away but getting closer. Jake's hand went automatically to his rifle. "They're not giving up," he muttered. "Stubborn bastards, I'll give them that." Princess had heard the engines too, and her expression had shifted to something that looked like resolve. She stood gracefully, brushing off her robes, and began walking toward the edge of their shelter. "Whoa, hold on." Jake jumped up and caught her arm gently. "Where are you going?" She turned toward him and spoke earnestly, gesturing in the direction of the approaching sounds. Her meaning was clear even without translation. She was planning to turn herself in to protect him. "Oh, hell no," Jake said firmly, pulling her back toward cover. "That's not how this works, princess. We're in this together now." The confusion on her face was plain. She spoke again, more urgently this time, trying to explain something. Jake caught what sounded like concern in her voice. She was worried about him. "Listen to me," Jake said, taking her hands in his. The static tingle was stronger now, almost warm. "I don't know what those soldiers want with you, but I've seen enough bullies to know they're not planning anything good. And I've been a Marine long enough to know that we don't abandon people who need help." Princess stared up at him, her oversized eyes wide with something that might have been wonder. No one had ever spoken to her like that before. Jake was sure of it. The thought made him angry at whoever had made her expect abandonment as natural. The aircraft sounds were getting closer. Jake began moving their small camp deeper into the root shelter, gathering his gear and thinking tactically. The natural walls would provide some cover, but if the search teams had thermal sensors, they wouldn't stay hidden for long. That's when Princess did something that changed everything. She pressed both palms against the massive tree root behind them and closed her eyes in concentration. At first, nothing happened. Then, the bioluminescent patterns in the bark began to shift, darkening in some places and brightening in others. The effect spread outward from her hands like ripples in a pond. "What the hell?" Jake breathed, watching the light show spread through the forest around them. Within minutes, their entire area had gone dark, not black, but dim enough that anyone using visual sensors would have a hard time spotting them. The effect was subtle, natural-looking, as if this section of forest had simply entered a different phase of its light cycle. Princess opened her eyes and swayed slightly. Jake caught her elbow to steady her. "That was you?" he asked, looking around at their camouflaged position. "You did that?" She nodded, but her expression was troubled. She spoke softly, gesturing at the dim trees, and Jake caught what sounded like an apology in her tone. "Are you kidding me?" Jake said, grinning despite their situation. "That was incredible. Do you know how many lives that kind of ability could save?" Princess blinked at his enthusiasm, clearly not understanding his words but picking up on his tone. Her expression shifted from apologetic to confused. She pointed to herself and said something that sounded like a question. "Yes, you," Jake said firmly. "Whatever that was, it was amazing. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." The aircraft passed overhead without slowing, their search beams sweeping harmlessly over the darkened section of forest. Jake and Princess waited in silence until the sounds faded completely before either of them moved. "Okay," Jake said, settling back against the roots. "New plan. We need to figure out communication, find out what this is all about, and decide where we go from here." Princess had been watching his face as he spoke, and something in her expression suggested she understood more than she was letting on. She touched her pendant again, then pointed to Jake and spoke carefully. "What about me?" Jake interpreted. "Good question. I'm just a supply runner who got shot down in the wrong place at the wrong time."
But, apparently, I'm also the guy who's going to keep you safe until we figure out what's going on.
Princess studied his face for a long moment, then did something unexpected. She reached out and touched the military insignia on his torn uniform shirt. Her fingers traced the eagle, globe, and anchor emblem of the Marine Corps with something like reverence. "Warrior," she said in accented but clear English.
Jake nearly choked on his water. "You speak English?"
Princess shook her head, then tapped her pendant. "Learn," she said carefully.
"Listen, learn. Your pendant translates languages?"
Jake asked, leaning forward with interest. "Slow," Princess admitted, her English heavily accented but understandable.
"Need time. But, yes, learn your words from your mind voice."
Telepathy, Jake realized.
The pendant reads thoughts and translates them.
Princess nodded, then held up one finger in a wait gesture. She closed her eyes and touched the pendant again. When she opened them, her English was noticeably clearer. "I am grateful," she said, her voice soft but determined.
"You risk life for me. This is unknown." "Unknown?" Jake echoed. "What do you mean?"
Princess struggled with the words for a moment, then touched her pendant again.
"My people, they see broken thing. Useless. You see, person worth protecting."
The pain in her voice made Jake's chest tighten.
"Your own people did this to you? Left you in the forest for those soldiers to find?" "Not left," Princess corrected, her English improving with each exchange through the pendant. "Abandoned. Thrown away. I am defective princess. Blind, weak. Cannot rule, cannot fight, cannot marry for alliance. So, exile."
"That's the biggest load of crap I've ever heard," Jake said firmly.
"You just camouflaged an entire section of forest with your mind. How is that weak?"
Princess looked down at her hands.
"Power is wrong. Not supposed to have. Royal family has technology, strategy, politics. Not this."
She gestured vaguely at the darkened trees.
"This is ancient, forbidden. Makes me more useless, not less." "Forbidden?" Jake asked. "Why?" "Long story," Princess said sadly. "My people fear the old powers. Think they make civilization weak, dependent on things we cannot control or understand."
Jake was quiet for a moment, processing what she'd told him.
"What's your real name?" "Your actual name, not what I can pronounce."
She spoke a phrase that sounded like silver bells and flowing water. Jake tried to repeat it and failed spectacularly. Princess smiled despite her sadness. "Call me Lyra," she said.
"Is close enough in your language?"
"Lyra," Jake repeated, liking the way it sounded.
"That's beautiful.
So, Lyra, let me make sure I understand this. Your people exiled you because you're blind and because you have abilities they're afraid of.
Those soldiers were sent to, what, kill you?" Lyra's expression darkened. "Not kill. Worse. There are places for broken royals. Make sure we cannot embarrass family, cannot use forbidden powers to threaten civilization." "Prison camps," Jake said grimly.
They were taking you to a prison camp.
"Forever," Lyra confirmed. "Until death. Unless." She touched her pendant nervously. "Unless what?" "Unless someone claims responsibility for me. Like, guardian." "But, who would want broken princess?"
Jake looked at this remarkable woman, this alien royal with powers that could apparently manipulate living systems, who had been thrown away by her own people for being different, and felt something solid settle in his chest.
"Me," he said simply. "I would."
Lyra stared at him, her luminous eyes wide with shock.
"You do not understand. Would mean giving up your life, your people, your world. Guardian is bound until death. Cannot leave, cannot return to old life."
"Sounds like marriage," Jake said with a grin.
"Worse things have happened." "This is not joke," Lyra said urgently. "You would be outcast, like me. Hunted, if we run. Prisoners, if we stay.
Jake was quiet for a moment, thinking about his life back on Earth.
A small apartment in a military town, no family left alive, friends scattered across the galaxy on various deployments. What was he really giving up?
Lyra, he said carefully, what kind of life were you looking forward to in that prison camp?
None, she admitted. Just existence until death.
And, what kind of life do you think I was living as a cargo jockey running supplies between military bases?
Lyra considered this. Lonely?
Very lonely, Jake confirmed. So here's what I'm thinking. You need someone who's too stubborn to abandon you when things get tough. I need someone who's worth being stubborn for.
Seems like we might be able to help each other out.
Lyra was silent for a long moment, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper.
You would truly do this? Become guardian to Broken Princess?
You're not broken, Jake said firmly.
You're extraordinary.
And, yes, I would do this.
But, I need to know, is this what you want? Not what your people want, not what those soldiers want. What do you want?
For the first time since he'd found her, Lyra smiled with genuine joy instead of just gratitude. The expression transformed her face, making her luminous in a way that had nothing to do with alien biology. I want to live, she said simply.
Not just exist.
Live. With someone who sees person, not burden. Then, it's settled, Jake said, extending his hand.
Partners?
Lyra looked at his outstretched hand, then, placed her own palm against his. The static tingle was immediate and warm, but now it felt like connection rather than simply alien contact.
Partners, she agreed.
Above them, the search aircraft had moved on to other sections of forest, but Jake knew they would be back. The Zephyrians weren't going to give up easily, and eventually they would bring enough sensors and manpower to find any hiding place. But, as Jake looked at Lyra's determined expression and felt the warm tingle of her hand in his, he realized that running and hiding wasn't going to be their long-term strategy. If they were going to build any kind of life together, they would need to take a more active approach to their problems. Lyra, he said thoughtfully, tell me about these old powers of yours.
What exactly can you do?
She hesitated, then touched her pendant for a moment.
I can speak with living systems.
Plants, some animals, biological machines.
Can ask them to change, to help, to hide.
She gestured at the darkened forest around them.
But, is weak, limited. Not like stories of ancient times. What were the ancients supposed to be able to do?
Everything, Lyra said simply. Control weather, move mountains, heal with touch, speak across infinite distances.
But, those are myths. Stories to frighten children.
Jake thought about the sophisticated biological technology he'd observed on Zephyrian ships and installations.
What if those myths were actually historical accounts of abilities that had been bred or trained out of the population?
Lyra, he said slowly, what if they're not myths? What if your people gave up these abilities because they were afraid of them? Then, I am proof they were right to fear, Lyra said sadly. Look what one broken princess has brought down on both of us. No, Jake said firmly. Look what one remarkable woman has shown me about what's worth fighting for. The sound of distant engines was returning, closer this time. Jake gathered his gear and helped Lyra to her feet.
Time to go, he said.
But, we're not running forever.
If you're willing to trust me, I think I know someone who might be able to help us.
Who?
Lyra asked as they began moving deeper into the forest. The human diplomatic mission, Jake said. My people have a saying, the enemy of my enemy is my friend.
And, something tells me that humans and exiled alien princesses might have more in common than anyone realizes. As they disappeared into the alien wilderness, neither of them noticed the way the forest itself seemed to shift around them, paths opening where none had existed before, while thorny barriers sprouted to block the routes behind them. Lyra's powers were growing stronger. But, more importantly, she was finally learning what it meant to have someone believe in her potential instead of focusing on her limitations. The hunt was far from over, but, for the first time in her life, Lyra wasn't facing it alone. The human diplomatic compound sat like a small fortress of angular steel and ceramics amid the flowing organic architecture of the Zephyrian capital city. Ambassador Sarah Chen had designed it that way deliberately, a statement that humanity would not be absorbed into alien aesthetics, no matter how beautiful they might be. But, as she stood in her office watching the morning news feeds from across Zephyrian space, Chen wondered if her architectural choices had been wise. Every channel was covering the same story: a human terrorist had attacked royal guards and kidnapped Princess Lyralii Zepthyros, the infamous blind daughter of the ruling family. The images being broadcast were grainy surveillance footage from the forest, showing a human soldier firing on Zephyrian warriors. The quality was deliberately poor, but Chen could make out enough details to recognize standard marine combat gear.
Ambassador, her aide, Lieutenant Marcus Webb, knocked on her office door before entering.
"I've got the preliminary analysis you requested."
Chen turned from the news display.
Webb was a good kid, fresh out of the Diplomatic Corps Academy, but he had military intelligence training that came in handy for situations like this.
"Tell me it's not one of ours," Chen said, though she already knew better.
"It's definitely one of ours," Webb confirmed, handing her a tablet. "Marine Sergeant Jake Morrison, assigned to cargo, runs between our facility and the outer system installations. His transport was reported missing 2 days ago, last known position approximately 50 kilometers from where this incident occurred." Chen scrolled through Morrison's service record. Decorated veteran, clean disciplinary record, no history of diplomatic incidents.
"What's his psychological profile?"
"Textbook Marine," Webb replied. "Strong protective instincts, tends to take personal responsibility for mission outcomes, excellent performance under pressure. The kind of soldier who would throw himself on a grenade to save civilians. Or who would attack alien soldiers to protect someone he saw being mistreated," Chen added grimly.
"Have we been able to contact him?"
"No direct communication, but..."
Webb hesitated. "There have been some interesting developments."
Chen looked up from the tablet.
"Explain."
3 separate Zephyrian military units have gone missing in the forest search zones over the past 18 hours. Not destroyed, missing. Their aircraft and personnel simply vanished without distress signals or wreckage.
Equipment malfunction?
That's what the Zephyrians are claiming publicly, but their private military channels are reporting something else. Vegetation that moves to block paths, sensor equipment that fails selectively, and aircraft that develop mysterious power fluctuations when they enter certain areas of forest.
Chen felt a chill run down her spine.
They think Morrison has alien technology? They think Morrison has Princess Lyralii, Webb corrected. And Princess Lyralii has abilities that the royal family has been very eager to keep quiet.
What kind of abilities?
Webb pulled up another file on his tablet. This is where things get classified above my clearance level, Ambassador. But our intelligence suggests that some members of the royal bloodline possess what the Zephyrians call bioharmonic resonance, the ability to interface with and control biological systems. Including the forest they're hiding in, Chen realized. Including the forest they're hiding in, Webb confirmed. Which would explain why the most technologically advanced military in this sector of space can't find 2 people on foot.
Chen was quiet for a moment, thinking through the implications.
The Zephyrians had been humanity's most reluctant allies in the galactic community, accepting diplomatic relations only because human manufacturing and raw materials were too valuable to ignore. But they had never hidden their contempt for what they saw as a primitive, barbaric species. Now one of those primitive barbarians had apparently rescued their exiled princess and was making their military look incompetent on the galactic news feeds.
"Ma'am," Webb said carefully, "there's something else you should know."
"More good news?"
"The Zephyrian government has formally requested that we turn over Sergeant Morrison for prosecution as a terrorist. They're threatening to revoke our trade agreements if we don't comply."
Chen sank into her chair. Trade agreements that represented billions of credits in revenue for Earth, not to mention access to Zephyrian technology that was centuries ahead of human development.
"What's the timeline on their ultimatum?"
72 hours, Webb replied. "But, Ambassador, there's something that doesn't add up about this whole situation."
"Such as?
Why was Princess Lyralii in the forest alone in the first place?" According to the official story, she was being evacuated for her own safety when Morrison attacked the escort.
But, evacuated from what? And why was the escort made up of Royal Guard Special Forces instead of regular security? Chen looked back at the news footage.
The Zephyrian warriors were indeed wearing the distinctive armor of the Royal Guard elite troops who were typically assigned to protect the royal family from external threats, not to babysit an exiled princess.
You think they were planning to kill her, Chen said.
I think someone wanted her to disappear quietly, and Morrison interfered with their plans, Webb replied.
Which means he's not just a kidnapper, he's a witness to attempted murder.
Before Chen could respond, her communication console chimed with an incoming priority message. The display showed a scrambled transmission originating from somewhere in the Zephyrian wilderness.
Ambassador Chen, Jake Morrison's voice came through clearly despite the interference. I hope you're receiving this. I know what this looks like, but I need you to hear my side of the story before you decide whether to throw me to the wolves. Chen exchanged glances with Webb before responding. Sergeant Morrison, this is Ambassador Chen. I'm listening.
Thank you, ma'am. First thing you need to know, I didn't kidnap anyone. I prevented a murder. Princess Lyralii was being executed by Royal Guard forces when I intervened.
Can you prove that?
There was a pause, then a different voice came through the communicator, musical, accented, but speaking clear English.
Ambassador Chen, this is Princess Lyralii Zephyros, rightful heir to the Zephyrian throne. Sergeant Morrison saved my life when my own family's soldiers were sent to kill me.
Chen felt her worldview shift slightly. Your Highness, you're supposed to be a kidnapping victim. I am a victim, Lyralii replied.
But not of Sergeant Morrison. My family exiled me because I possess abilities they considered dangerous to social order. When exile was not enough to satisfy them, they decided permanent silence was preferable. What kind of abilities?
Another pause, then Jake's voice returned. Ambassador, Princess Lyralii can interface with biological systems in ways that make Zephyrian biotechnology look like stone tools. She can communicate with and control living organisms at a level that could revolutionize everything from agriculture to medicine.
And that's dangerous how?
Because it proves that Zephyrian civilization is built on the suppression of natural abilities, Lyralii said, her voice carrying notes of centuries-old sadness. For 2,000 years, my people have chosen technology over biology, artifice over natural harmony. Those of us who manifest the old gifts are proof that another path was possible. Chen was beginning to understand the political implications.
You represent a challenge to their entire social structure.
She represents hope for a better future, Jake said firmly. Which is why we're not going to let them bury her in some secret prison camp.
Sergeant Morrison, Chen said carefully, you understand that protecting her means defying a direct order from the Zephyrian government?
They want you extradited for prosecution.
With respect, Ambassador, they can want whatever they like. I'm not turning over an innocent woman to people who tried to murder her.
Webb leaned forward and spoke into the communicator.
Sergeant, this is Lieutenant Webb. What exactly are you proposing we do? The Zephyrians have threatened to revoke all trade agreements if we don't cooperate. Jake's laugh came through the static. Lieutenant, how long do you think those trade agreements would last if the galactic community found out that humanity stood by while allied royalty was assassinated for political convenience?
Chen felt a spark of hope.
Explain. Princess Lyralii is the legitimate heir to the Zephyrian throne, Jake said.
Her exile was illegal under their own succession laws, and the attempt on her life constitutes treason.
If we can prove that, we're not harboring a kidnapping victim or providing sanctuary to a head of state in exile.
Even if that's true, Chen replied, we don't have the military force to protect her from an entire star system.
We don't need military force, Lyralii's voice returned. We need documentation and witnesses.
Sergeant Morrison has recordings of the assassination attempt, and I have knowledge of other illegal actions taken by the current government. Chen looked at Webb, who was already pulling up files on his tablet.
The young officer's expression was grim. Ambassador, Webb said quietly, if Princess Lyralii is the legitimate heir and the current government staged a coup by exiling her illegally, then our trade agreements might not be valid anyway. We could be dealing with an illegitimate regime.
More importantly, Jake's voice cut through their conversation, we'd be on the right side of history. And something tells me that other species in the galactic community are getting tired of Zephyrian arrogance. Chen made a decision that would either save her career or end it spectacularly.
Sergeant Morrison, Princess Lyrelii, I'm authorizing emergency diplomatic sanctuary. Can you reach our compound?
Not without help, Jake replied. The entire forest is crawling with search teams, and Princess Lyrelii's abilities are starting to attract attention from things other than the Royal Guard.
What kind of things?
Lyrelii answered this time, her voice troubled. The old powers call to each other, Ambassador. There are others like me, hidden throughout Zephyrian space, who have felt my awakening.
Some wish to help. Others do not. Meaning?
Meaning there are factions within the hidden communities that believe the old ways should remain buried, Jake explained.
And they're willing to kill to keep it that way.
Chen rubbed her temples, feeling a headache building. So we have the current government trying to kill you, their own military hunting you, and now rebel factions from your own people who also want you dead? That's about the size of it, Jake confirmed cheerfully. But, on the bright side, we're building quite an alliance. Turns out there are a lot more people unhappy with the current situation than anyone realized.
What do you mean? Lyrelii's voice carried new confidence.
The exile communities are larger than the government admits, Sergeant Morrison. Thousands of my people live in hidden settlements throughout the system, refugees from the purges that followed the technology mandate. They have been waiting for someone to unite them.
And, you think that someone is you?
Chen asked.
I think that someone is us, Jake corrected. Princess Lyrelii has the bloodline and the abilities. I have the military training and the outside perspective. Together, we might be able to give these people a chance to come home.
Chen looked at the news feed still playing on her wall display. The search for the human terrorist was expanding, with Royal Guard units now supplemented by civilian militias and volunteer hunting parties. The situation was escalating beyond simple diplomatic incident into something that could reshape the entire sector. Lieutenant Webb, she said decisively, I need you to prepare a full intelligence briefing on Zephyrian succession laws and the legal status of Princess Lyrelii's exile. I also need a tactical assessment of our defensive capabilities.
Ma'am?
If we're going to do this, we're going to do it properly.
Sergeant Morrison, Princess Lyrelii, I'm formally recognizing Princess Lyrelii as head of state in exile and granting her full diplomatic protection under human authority.
The silence on the communicator stretched for several seconds before Jake responded.
Ambassador, you do realize you just declared independence from the Zephyrian government?
I declared support for the legitimate government of Zephyrian space, Chen corrected.
There's a difference.
How long do you need to reach our compound?
Give us 48 hours, Jake replied.
Princess Lyrelii needs time to contact the exile communities and coordinate our arrival. And we need to deal with the faction that's been tracking us.
Deal with them how?
However, we have to, Jake said grimly. These people tried to kill her once already.
I'm not giving them a second chance.
After the transmission ended, Chen stood looking out her office window at the alien cityscape beyond. Somewhere in the forest that surrounded the capital, a marine sergeant and an alien princess were planning what amounted to a revolution. Webb, she said without turning around, send a priority message to Earth Command. Tell them we may need backup, and we may need it soon.
What kind of backup, ma'am?
Chen thought about Jake Morrison's service record, about Princess Lyrelii's growing abilities, and about the thousands of exiled Zephyrians who were apparently ready to fight for a chance to come home. The kind that's good at impossible odds, she replied. And tell them to bring everything they've got. Outside her window, the alien forest seemed to shimmer in the distance, and Chen could swear she saw patterns of light moving through the trees like signals. Whatever Jake and Lyrelii were planning, it was already beginning. The question was whether humanity was ready to face the consequences of standing against one of the most powerful civilizations in the galaxy. Chen looked at Morrison's service record one more time and smiled grimly. If there was one thing humans were good at, it was taking on impossible fights for the right reasons. It was time to remind the galaxy why that could be a very dangerous trait to ignore. Deep in the heart of the alien forest, Jake Morrison crouched behind a massive root formation and watched something that shouldn't have been possible. Through his rifle scope, he could see Lyralii standing in a clearing 30 meters away, her hands pressed against the trunk of one of the enormous silver trees. Around her, the forest was alive with movement. Not the normal movement of wind through branches, but purposeful, coordinated activity. Vines were weaving themselves into complex patterns, creating what looked like a three-dimensional map in the air above Lyralii's head. Different sections pulsed with different colors of bioluminescence, and, as Jake watched, new lights appeared and disappeared in rapid succession. She was communicating with the exile communities scattered throughout Zephyrian space, using the forest itself as a biological communication network. "This is impossible," whispered Talon, the Zephyrian exile who had found them 12 hours earlier. He was tall and angular like all his species, but his skin had the weathered look of someone who had spent years in hiding. More importantly, he was one of the few exiles who still remembered the old languages and customs. "No," Jake replied quietly, never taking his eyes off Lyralii. "This is what they've been afraid of." The tactical situation had changed dramatically since Ambassador Chen's offer of sanctuary. What had started as two fugitives running through the forest had evolved into something much larger. Talon's arrival had been the first sign that word was spreading through the hidden communities. He'd brought news that other exile settlements were mobilizing, but also that the faction opposed to Lyralii's return was moving against them. Shadow Singers, Talon had called them. Exiles who believe the old powers should die with the old ways. They fear that Princess Lyralii's awakening will bring destruction to all our people. Jake had listened to the explanation with growing concern. It was one thing to fight Royal Guard soldiers who were following orders. It was something else entirely to face opponents who genuinely believed they were saving their species by killing Lyralii. Now, watching her coordinate what looked like a resistance network spanning multiple star systems, Jake was beginning to understand why both sides were terrified of her potential. The vine map above Lyralii's head shifted suddenly, several of the light clusters flashing urgent red. Lyralii's eyes snapped open and she stumbled backward from the tree. "They come," she said, her voice carrying an edge of panic Jake had never heard before. "The Shadow Singers move against the Kithara settlement. They will kill everyone to prevent aid reaching us." "How far?" Jake asked, already reaching for his gear. 50 kilometers north, Talon replied. "Perhaps 300 people, mostly families with children." Jake did rapid calculations in his head. Royal Guard search teams were closing in from the south and east. Shadow Singer assassins were moving against their allies to the north. And, somewhere in the forest, other exile groups were trying to reach them before one of the hostile forces succeeded. "We can't be in 3 places at once," Jake said grimly. "No," Lyralii agreed, "but we don't need to be." She pressed her palms against the ground, and the forest floor beneath them began to glow with the same patterns they'd seen in the trees. "The forest remembers, Jake. Every root, every branch, every leaf connected across vast distances. I can be many places through the network." "What about us?" Talon asked. "The Shadow Singers will not be deterred by forest tricks. They know the old ways as well as Princess Lyralii." Jake checked his rifle and ammunition. Still 2 magazines for his primary weapon, plus his sidearm and knife. Not much against professional killers, but it would have to do. "Then, we go old school," he said. "Talon, you said the Kithara settlement has defenses?" "Some. Hidden bunkers, escape routes. But nothing that will stop determined attackers with military training. Then, we make sure the attackers never reach them." Jake looked at Lyralii, who was still connected to the forest network. "Princess, can you guide us through the forest faster than normal travel?" "Yes," she replied without opening her eyes. "But, Jake, the Shadow Singers are not like Royal Guards. They have abilities similar to mine, and they know this forest as well as I do. Good thing I'm not planning to fight them like Zephyrians," Jake said with a grim smile. 3 hours later, Jake lay in concealment at the edge of a ravine, watching a force of Shadow Singer infiltrators move through the forest below. There were 8 of them, dressed in organic-looking armor that seemed to shift and blend with the surrounding vegetation. They moved with the fluid grace of dancers, making almost no sound as they advanced toward the hidden settlement. They were beautiful, deadly, and completely unprepared for human tactics.
Jake's first shot took the Point Scout Center mass, the crack of his rifle echoing through the ravine like thunder.
The other Shadow Singers scattered with inhuman speed, but Jake was already moving to his second position. He'd learned urban warfare in places where enemies could appear from any direction, and forest fighting wasn't that different if you understood the principles.
Never stay in the same place twice. Always have an escape route. Make them react to you instead of planning their own moves.
His second shot missed as the target dove behind a massive tree root, but it served its purpose. The Shadow Singers were now focused on him instead of their original mission. Jake heard them calling to each other in the old Zephyrian language, their voices carrying harmonics that seemed to make the forest itself respond.
Branches began moving to block his sightlines.
Roots erupted from the ground to trip him as he moved between positions. The very air seemed to thicken, making it harder to breathe and aim. But Jake had advantages they hadn't counted on.
Human stubbornness, for one thing.
And Lyraliai's support through the forest network, for another. As the Shadow Singers tried to pin him down with their botanical manipulation, other sections of forest began responding to Lyraliai's influence.
Vines suddenly entangled two of the assassins just as they were flanking Jake's position.
A massive branch fell across the ravine, cutting off their retreat route. Most importantly, the trees began carrying Jake's voice across impossible distances, letting him coordinate with Talon and the other exile defenders who were moving to protect the settlement. "Talon, they're moving toward your position, but they're scattered now," Jake reported, putting another round toward a Shadow Singer who had tried to rush his cover. "2 down, 6 mobile, but they've lost unit cohesion." "Understood," came Talon's voice through the forest communication network.
"Settlement defenders are in position."
Jake reloaded and assessed his tactical situation. The Shadow Singers were adapting to his unconventional approach, using their forest abilities to create barriers and traps. But they were also revealing their positions every time they manipulated the environment, and Jake was starting to recognize the patterns. More importantly, they were fighting like individuals instead of a unit. Each Shadow Singer was using their own abilities independently, creating a chaotic mix of competing influences on the forest around them. Jake had seen the same thing happen with elite special forces units when they were thrown off their operational rhythm. They fell back on individual skills instead of team coordination. Time to exploit that weakness. Jake abandoned stealth entirely and began moving aggressively through the forest, his rifle firing rapid, aimed shots that forced the Shadow Singers to respond defensively. He wasn't trying to hit them, he was trying to make them reveal their positions and abilities. It worked. Within minutes, Jake had a clear picture of where each remaining assassin was positioned and how they were using their powers. More importantly, he could see the interference patterns where their abilities conflicted with each other. "Lyraliai," he called through the forest network, "can you amplify those interference patterns?" "Yes," came her immediate reply. "But it will require considerable energy." "Do it." "Talon, when I give the signal, hit them hard from the settlement side. They'll be disoriented and unable to coordinate their defenses." Jake counted down from 5, then opened fire with everything he had. His automatic fire was designed not to hit the Shadow Singers but to drive them toward specific positions where their competing abilities would create maximum interference. At the same moment, Lyraliai poured her power into the forest network, amplifying the conflicting influences until the very air around the Shadow Singers began to shimmer and warp. Trees groaned as they were pulled in different directions by competing commands. The ground itself seemed to ripple with conflicting instructions. The Shadow Singers, caught in a web of their own making, found themselves unable to use their abilities effectively. Worse, they were now silhouetted against the chaotic light show of the malfunctioning forest, easy targets for Talon and the settlement defenders who emerged from concealment with weapons blazing. The firefight was over in less than 30 seconds. Jake emerged from his position to find 6 more Shadow Singers dead and the forest slowly returning to normal as Lyraliai withdrew her influence. Talon and a dozen other exile fighters were moving through the area, securing weapons and checking for survivors. "Impressive," Talon said as Jake approached the main group.
I had not believed human tactics could be effective against Shadow Singer abilities. Different doesn't mean better or worse, Jake replied, checking his remaining ammunition. Just different. How are the settlement defenders? 3 wounded, none seriously. The families are safe. Talon paused, looking around at the aftermath of the battle. But this was only one group of Shadow Singers. There will be others. Let them come, Jake said firmly. We're not hiding anymore. Over the next 18 hours, the situation in the Zephyrian forest evolved from manhunt to open conflict. Word of the Shadow Singer's defeat spread through the exile communities, carried by the forest network that Lyralii was learning to use with increasing skill and range. More exile groups began moving toward their position, bringing weapons, supplies, and, most importantly, intelligence about Royal Guard movements and Shadow Singer strongholds. What had started as a handful of refugees was growing into something that looked suspiciously like an army. Jake stood in what had become their makeshift command center, a natural amphitheater formed by massive tree roots where Lyralii could interface with the forest network while coordinating with multiple groups simultaneously. Around the perimeter, exile sentries kept watch with a combination of traditional weapons and forest-based abilities that made conventional detection systems useless. Status report, Jake said as Talon approached with the latest intelligence summaries. 230 fighters now under our coordinated command, Talon reported. Another 400 civilians in settlements that have declared support for Princess Lyralii's claim to the throne. Opposition forces? Royal Guard has committed 3 full regiments to the search, approximately 1,500 troops with heavy equipment. Shadow Singer estimates are more difficult, but our sources suggest at least 50 active cells, perhaps 500 individual assassins. Jake whistled softly. So we're outnumbered roughly 10-1 by professional military forces, plus an unknown number of magical ninjas who want to kill us for ideological reasons. That would be accurate, Talon confirmed. However, we have advantages they do not expect. Such as? Talon gestured toward Lyralii, who was deep in communion with the forest network. Around her, patterns of light flowed through the trees in complex, beautiful configurations that Jake was beginning to recognize as tactical information. Princess Lyralii's abilities grow stronger each day, Talon explained. The network responds to her more readily, and her range continues to expand. More importantly, she is learning to share her connection with others. Meaning? Meaning that exile fighters across the forest are beginning to access abilities they had thought lost forever. The old powers are awakening throughout our people. Jake watched Lyralii work, noting the way her expression had changed over the past few days. The scared, helpless girl he had rescued was gone, replaced by someone who moved with the confidence of command and spoke with the authority of someone who had found their purpose. But there was something else in her expression now, a determination that bordered on ruthless. The more she learned about the scope of her people's suffering, the more her anger grew. Jake was beginning to worry about what she might be willing to do if she felt it was necessary. Talon, Jake said carefully, what exactly was Princess Lyralii's father planning to do with the exile communities? The current king, I mean. Talon's expression darkened. Complete elimination. Not just the active exile settlements, but anyone carrying the genetic markers for the old abilities. A final purge to ensure that the technology mandate could never be challenged. Genocide, Jake said grimly. Genocide, Talon confirmed. Princess Lyralii's awakening accelerated the timeline, but the plan was already in motion. Her rescue was not just for her own sake, it was to prevent the extinction of everything we represent. Jake understood now why Lyralii's smile had been so transformative when he first met her. She hadn't just been grateful for rescue, she had been amazed that someone considered her worth saving. The depth of her people's rejection went beyond politics into something that approached species-level self-hatred. How many? Jake asked quietly. Total exile population? Perhaps 10,000 scattered across Zephyrian space. But the genetic markers are much more widespread, maybe 10% of the total population carries them, whether they know it or not. So we're talking about killing millions of people to eliminate a perceived genetic threat. Perceived is correct, Talon said bitterly. The old abilities are not dangerous in themselves.
But they represent a path our civilization chose not to take, and their existence challenges the foundation of our entire social structure. Jake was quiet for a moment, thinking about the implications. This wasn't just about rescuing one alien princess anymore. This was about preventing an act of genocide that would dwarf anything in human history. "Ambassador Chen," he said into his communicator, "we need to talk."
Chen's voice came through immediately.
"Go ahead, Sergeant."
"Ma'am, the situation here is bigger than we thought. We're not just dealing with a succession dispute, we're dealing with attempted genocide on a scale that would make the worst human atrocities look minor by comparison."
There was silence on the channel for several seconds before Chen responded.
"Can you prove that?" "Princess Lyrelii can provide documentation and witness testimony.
But, more importantly, we're building an alliance of exile communities that could serve as evidence of the scope of the problem."
"What do you need from us?"
Jake looked around at the growing encampment of exile fighters, at Lyrelii coordinating resistance efforts across multiple star systems, and at the alien forest that was slowly being transformed into a fortress by the awakening powers of an oppressed people.
"Time," he said simply.
"And, when the shooting starts in earnest, backup."
"Lots of backup." "Understood."
"Jake?"
"Yes, ma'am?"
"Don't let them turn this into a war if you can avoid it."
"But, if war is unavoidable, make sure you win it."
Jake looked at Lyrelii, her face serene in concentration as she wielded powers that could reshape entire ecosystems, and thought about the forces arrayed against them.
"Copy that, Ambassador. One way or another, we're going to win this."
But, as Jake spoke those words, neither he nor Ambassador Chen knew that the Zephyrian Royal Council had just voted to authorize the use of orbital bombardment platforms to sterilize the forest areas where the exile communities had gathered. The real war was about to begin. The warning came through the forest network like a wave of terror crashing over every connected mind in the Exile Alliance.
Lyrelii's eyes snapped open, her face pale with horror as the alien trees around her pulsed with urgent crimson light.
"Orbital platforms," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sudden chaos of panicking voices through the biological communication system.
"They mean to burn us all."
Jake Morrison felt his blood turn to ice as he processed the tactical implications. Orbital bombardment meant the Royal Guard had given up on capturing them alive. This was no longer about stopping a rebellion, this was about sterilizing a genetic line before it could spread. "How long?" he asked, already reaching for his communicator. Lyrelii pressed both palms against the massive tree trunk, her luminous eyes reflecting the urgent patterns flowing through the bark.
"The platforms are moving into position now. Perhaps 2 hours before they achieve firing solutions on all exile settlements."
"Ambassador Chen," Jake spoke rapidly into his communicator, "we have an immediate crisis situation. The Zephyrians are preparing orbital bombardment of civilian populations."
Chen's response was immediate and sharp. "Are you certain?" "Princess Lyrelii is monitoring their communications through biological networks. They're targeting every exile settlement across the system."
There was silence on the channel for several seconds, then, Chen's voice returned with the calm authority of someone making a decision that would define her career. "Sergeant Morrison, by the authority vested in me as representative of the Terran Republic, I am formally recognizing Princess Lyrelii as the legitimate head of the Zephyrian government in exile, and I am declaring our intention to provide military assistance against acts of genocide."
"Ma'am, we don't have military assets in this system that can engage orbital platforms."
"We do now," Chen replied grimly.
ETA 20 minutes. Jake stared at his communicator in amazement. "Ma'am?"
"The Terran Republic has been watching this situation develop with great interest, Sergeant. You've been fighting the opening battles of a war that was inevitable. Now the real military arrives to finish what you started." Around the command clearing, exile fighters were moving with desperate efficiency, breaking down equipment and preparing for evacuation. But Jake could see the despair in their faces. You couldn't outrun orbital bombardment on foot, no matter how many forest paths you knew.
"Lyrelii," Jake said urgently, "can your network coordinate evacuation of all the settlements simultaneously?"
"No," she replied, her voice heavy with sorrow.
"Too many people, too great distances. We can save perhaps half if we begin immediately." "That's not good enough."
Lyralii looked up at him, and, for a moment she was the scared, helpless girl he had rescued what felt like a lifetime ago.
Jake, I cannot work miracles. My abilities have limits.
Your current abilities have limits, Jake corrected, moving to kneel beside her.
But, what about the abilities you haven't discovered yet? I don't understand.
Jake thought about everything he had seen over the past week: forest paths that opened before them and, closed behind, search teams that became lost in familiar territory, aircraft that developed mysterious malfunctions. Lyralii had been unconsciously influencing biological systems on a massive scale without realizing the true scope of her power. The forest network doesn't just connect trees on this world, Jake said intensely. It connects to orbital installations, space stations, even starships.
Everything with biological components can be reached. Understanding dawned in Lyralii's luminous eyes. The orbital platforms themselves are crewed by Zephyrians with the same genetic markers you carry. You're not just connected to the exiles, princess, you're connected to everyone.
Lyralii stared at him, then, slowly placed her palms against the ground once more. This time, instead of the localized patterns they had grown accustomed to, light began flowing outward from her position like ripples in a vast pond. The illumination spread through the root systems, up through the trees, and, then, seemed to leap impossibly from branch to branch into the sky itself.
I can feel them, she whispered in amazement. The crews on the platforms, the soldiers in the orbital stations. They carry the markers, Jake. All of them. Can you reach them? I can try.
What happened next would be analyzed by xenobiologists and military strategists for generations to come.
Lyralii's consciousness, amplified by the forest network and guided by connections she had never known existed, spread outward from the planet's surface to touch every biological system within light minutes of their position.
To the crews aboard the orbital bombardment platforms, it began as a whisper at the edge of perception, a voice speaking in harmonies they remembered from childhood lullabies, calling them by names their own families had forgotten. The voice spoke of connections deeper than technology, of purposes greater than orders, of choices that would define their species for millennia to come.
You are not machines, Lyralii's voice resonated through biological neural networks that Zephyrian technology had deemed obsolete. You are not tools to be used for destroying your own people. You are children of the old forest, and it is time to come home. On the bridge of the flagship orbital platform, Commander Vectus felt something impossible happening. His hands, reaching to activate the bombardment sequence, suddenly refused to obey his conscious will. Around him, his crew stood frozen as internal conflicts raged between duty and instincts they had thought bred out of their bloodline centuries ago. "Sir," his weapons officer reported in a voice filled with wonder, "I cannot execute the firing command. My hands, they will not move to destroy the forest." Similar scenes played out across the orbital platform fleet.
Engineers found themselves sabotaging targeting systems instead of calibrating them. Navigation officers discovered they could no longer plot firing solutions on areas where exile communities had gathered.
Medical staff began reporting that their patients' vital signs were synchronizing with rhythms that seemed to originate from the planet below.
But the awakening went far beyond simple sabotage.
As Lyralii's influence spread through the fleet, dormant abilities began manifesting in crew members who had never suspected their genetic heritage. Ships' biological components started responding to mental commands instead of mechanical interfaces.